July 4th, 1991. While America celebrated Independence Day, India was doing something no sovereign nation wants to do, pledging its gold to stay afloat. 47 tons of physical gold bar loaded into wooden crates, flown secretly from Mumbai to London on a chartered flight. Destination, you ask? Bank of England's vaults. The purpose? To secure a mere $240 million loan. That's right. India, a nation of 850 million people, had to mortgage its gold just to pay for 3 weeks of essential imports. But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't the first flight. 20 tons had already been sent to the Union Bank of Switzerland days earlier, and the government was so desperate that it was shipping gold in installments, hoping nobody would notice. Our foreign exchange reserves had collapsed to $1.2 billion, only enough to cover just 2 weeks of imports. For context, today India holds over 600 billions in reserves. Back then, we couldn't even afford 2 weeks of fuel, medicine and food. But who knew back then that this was the beginning of the great Indian comeback? The price of being a closed, protectionist, state-controlled, inward-looking economy. This was India's financial emergency of 1991. Welcome to Angel One Economics. My name is Utsari, and today we decode the crisis that changed India forever. The 1991 balance of payment crisis and how one summer of panic forced the most impactful reforms our economy has ever seen. To understand why India reached the edge of an economic collapse in 1991, it is important to first clear a common misconception. The crisis did not emerge because Indian economy had stopped growing, nor because agriculture had failed or because industry had collapsed. In fact, if one were to look only at headline numbers in the late 1980s, the picture would appear surprisingly reassuring. Because just the previous year, India's real GDP was growing at 5.2%, coming immediately after a remarkable 10.4% growth another year before, one of the highest growth rates India had ever recorded in the post-independence era. Many of the targets laid out under the 7th plan were in fact exceeded. Average GDP growth stood above its original target. Agricultural growth outperformed expectations. Industrial production continued to expand at 9%, and manufacturing output grew faster than planned. There was very little to suggest that India was headed towards a balance of payment crisis. Production was holding up well. Monsoons were favorable. Food grain stocks were comfortable, and the economy appeared resilient even when it was entering 1991. So, if anything, the prevailing narrative at the time was that India had finally moved past the so-called Hindu rate of growth, which is an economic term that economist Raj Krishna coined, saying that the Hindu rate of growth, which is 3 to 4%, is a sluggish growth rate due to protectionist policies. However, the real vulnerability of the economy did not lie in how much India was producing, but in how that production was being financed. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to the 1980s because the crisis didn't happen overnight, right? It was built brick by brick, loan by loan, and promise by promise. Picture this. It's 1980. Indira Gandhi is back in power. India's GDP growth has been stuck at 3.5% annually for decades, and the license Raj is in full swing. If you wanted to start a business, you needed permission. If you wanted to import machinery, you needed permission. If you wanted to expand production, you guessed it right, you needed permission. But here's what changed in 1980s. India discovered deficit financing. What is that? Deficit financing is when the government spends more than it earns and fills the gap by borrowing or printing more money. The government started spending money it did not have. Public sector expansion, subsidies, defense spending, all funded by borrowing. And for a few years, it worked pretty well. GDP growth picked up to 5 to 6%. Industrial production increased. People thought we've cracked the code. But there was a fundamental problem. We were borrowing to consume and not to produce. All in all, the government expenditure grew faster than the government income, which led to a huge gap between the revenue and the spending. And the borrowed loans allowed growth to continue in the short run, but gradually weakened the macroeconomic foundations of the economy. And this is why the strategy did deliver higher output growth for a few years, but it also led to a steady rise in inflationary pressures, deterioration in the fiscal discipline, and increasing dependence on foreign capital. Besides the borrowing problem, we also had an import problem. India's imports consistently exceeded exports by 5 to 8 billion every year through the 1980s. And this gap is called the trade deficit. And we were funding that gap by borrowing from abroad. The math was brutal. For every $100 we earned from exports, we spent $120 on imports. And the $20 gap, borrowed money. And here's where it gets interesting. Most of the borrowing was short-term commercial debt at high interest rates, not concessional loans from the development banks at all. Hence, by the late 1980s, alarm bells were already ringing. 1989 to 1990, we saw red flags. External debt climbed to $64 billion, which is 23% of GDP. 35% of export earnings were going just to repay the interest of the debt that we were borrowing. Foreign exchange reserves were barely covering 3 months of imports. India's credit rating was downgraded by Moody's, but India kept borrowing. Amidst political instability, nobody wanted to make hard economic decisions. The easy path was to keep borrowing and hope things improved, until they did not. Stay with me, the story just keeps getting worse from here. Trigger number 1, the Gulf War. In August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. For India, this was catastrophic on multiple fronts. Oil prices exploded like nothing. Pre-war price was $17 per barrel, but during the war, prices shot up to $36 per barrel. And India's doom started showing shape. Our oil imports jumped by more than $1 billion almost overnight. Remember, India was importing 70% of its oil back then, and this single shock increased our import bill massively while we earned the same from our exports. Trigger number 2, which is the NRI deposit flight. Here's something most people don't talk about. India had been attracting deposits from the non-resident Indians by offering high interest rates of 7 to 11% when the global rates were 3 to 4%. These NRI deposits had become a crucial source of foreign exchange, totaling about $11 billion. But then the Gulf War happened. Indian workers in the Gulf panicked. About 2 million Indians were working in the Middle East. They started withdrawing their NRI deposits, sending lesser money back home because they feared job loss. And within months, India faced a double whammy, which is higher oil bills and lower foreign exchange inflows. Trigger number 3. Political chaos. Months later from the Gulf War, VP Singh's government collapsed. Chandrasekhar became the prime minister with support from Congress, and it was basically a minority government surviving on borrowed time. Why does this matter? Because when you are in the middle of a financial crisis, you need decisive action. Instead, India had a caretaker government with no political mandate, nobody willing to make unpopular decisions, and complete policy paralysis. The government kept borrowing to delay the inevitable. They were literally buying time. A few more months, a few more weeks. But guys, what happens when you don't repay the loans back? Exactly. The credit rating collapses. So trigger number 4, the credit rating collapsed. In 1991, Moody's downgraded India's sovereign rating to barely investment grade. Meaning, international banks now viewed lending to India as risky. Interest rates on new loans shot up and some banks refused to lend at all. So India's reputation in the global markets was freefall. 40 years of Nehruvian socialism, license Raj, and import substitution had created an image that India was a closed economy, hostile to foreign investments, drowning in debt with no plan to reform. Trigger number 5. The reserves vanished. Here's where the numbers become terrifying. India's foreign exchange reserves from 1990 to 1991 were just depreciating. August 1990, we had about 3 months of imports. December 1990, we had about 2 months of imports. March 1991, we had about 6 weeks of imports. And June 1991, we had less than 2 weeks of imports. Now let that sink in. By June 1991, India barely had enough dollars to pay for 13 days of essential imports, which included fuel, medicines, food, industrial inputs. So what happens when you run out of foreign exchange exactly? You can't import crude oil. Petrol pumps run dry. Transportation stops. You can't import medicines. The healthcare system collapses. You can't import food grains. So prices skyrocket and people starve. And you can't service your debt. You default. Complete economic isolation. and India was staring at an economic apocalypse. Trigger number 6, assassination. If you're still waiting for the comeback, wait more, because to make things even worse, India saw another storm, the assassination of the former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. The markets panicked, political uncertainty all over the place, and the rupee crashed. By June 1991, when PV Narasimha Rao finally became the Prime Minister, he inherited reserves for 13 days of imports, $8 billion in debt payments due within months, a collapsing rupee, zero credibility with international lenders, and a country hours away from default. And this is when the gold flights actually started happening. Even before the new government took office, the caretaker administration knew that they needed cash immediately. In May 1991, pre-dawn hours, there were 20 tons of gold confiscated from smugglers, which was held by RBI, secretly packed into wooden crates, transported from RBI vaults in Mumbai to the airport, and then loaded onto a chartered plane, flown to Union Bank of Switzerland, pledged as collateral for $200 million loan. The government didn't announce it. They hoped nobody would actually find out, but word leaked. And after 2 months, even that $200 million was running out. The new government with PV Narasimha Rao as PM and Dr. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister faced the same impossible choice. And the same thing happened. 47 tons of gold from India's official reserves, again the pre-dawn operation, and this time flown to Bank of England in London, pledged for another $240 million. Combined, India had mortgaged 67 tons of gold for just $440 million, which is now worth $5 billion. But in 1991, we were so desperate that we took whatever we could get. Why was this so humiliating? Because gold in India isn't just a commodity. It's cultural, it's sacred, it's the representation of family wealth passed down generations, security in times of crisis, and national pride. So the newspapers called it mortgaging the family jewels. Opposition parties screamed 40 years of independence and we are back to being beggars again. But here's the thing, the humiliation worked because that image of gold bars being loaded onto planes seared itself into the national consciousness. It became impossible to deny that something was fundamentally broken. Now comes the twist in the story. Now we have a man who took the bullet. He was not a politician. He had never won any election. He was a Cambridge-educated economist, former RBI governor and bureaucrat. Quite uncharismatic, with a soft voice and a turban, and he was handed the worst job in India. The job of the finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. Imagine walking into your office and getting this brief on your day one. Sir, we have $1.2 billion in our reserves. We need to make a debt payment of $1.5 billion within the next 30 days. We've already pledged gold. The rupee is in a free fall. The inflation is at 13%. The growth has collapsed and IMF is our only option and they will impose strict conditions. Most people would resign on the spot. But Manmohan Singh got to work. India approached the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. But the IMF doesn't just hand out money like that, right? It demands structural adjustments. What the IMF wanted was to devalue the rupee, make it weaker, cut government spending, basically reduce the deficit, liberalize trade, basically reduce the import tariffs, open up to foreign investments, privatize the state-owned companies, and remove industrial licensing. These weren't suggestions, these were conditions. If India wanted the loan, it had to fundamentally restructure its economy. The loan package, you ask? $7 billion over 3 years from IMF and World Bank combined. For context, you ask? This was the largest bailout the IMF had ever given to any country at that time. Here's where it gets fascinating. PV Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh didn't just accept IMF conditions and implement them, they realized something crucial. The crisis gave them political cover to do reforms India needed anyways. For 40 years, people had argued for economic liberalization. For 40 years, the answer was, India is different, we need self-reliance, we can't trust foreign capital, socialism is our path. But now the alternative was national bankruptcy. So Rao and Singh used the crisis to push through changes that would have been politically impossible otherwise. In July 24, 1991, Manmohan Singh rose in parliament to present his first budget. His voice was soft, but his words were revolutionary. He began with a quote from Victor Hugo: "No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come." That's it. He laid out the reforms right after. Immediate actions. Currency devaluation. The rupee was devalued by 18% to make exports cheaper and imports costlier. Second, industrial delicensing. License Raj was dismantled for most industries, meaning entrepreneurs no longer needed government permission to produce. Only 6 industries remained under licensing. As a result, the trade was liberalized. Import tariffs slashed from 200% to 150%, although it was still high, but it was a good start. Then third, foreign investment opened. FDI allowed up to 51% in priority sectors, which was previously maximum of 40% with tons of restrictions. So now foreign portfolio investment in stock markets were also permitted. Now fourth, the financial sector was reformed. Private banks were allowed first time since the 1969 bank nationalization, and interest rates were partially deregulated. Now there was a political backlash. People who liked protectionism called it selling India to IMF, and the others called it abandoning Swadeshi. But Rao and Singh did not pay a single heed. They had just one thing in advantage, and that was fear. Everyone remembered the gold airlift. Manmohan Singh later admitted in his interviews that he went beyond what the IMF had demanded back then. The IMF wanted gradual liberalization, but Singh pushed for faster and deeper reforms. Why do you think so? Because he knew if we are going to face political backlash anyway, let's make the reforms count. It was a calculated bet. Short-term pain for long-term gain. So what actually happened after 1991? Did the reforms work? Let's look at the numbers. Foreign exchange reserves reached a comfortable level of $20 billion from $1.2 billion in 4 years. The GDP grew to 7.4% in 5 years from a crisis of 1.4%. The economy bounced back faster than anyone expected. The FDI inflows rose from basically nothing to $2 billion in just 5 years. That was a good start, right? Suddenly, global companies saw India as an opportunity, not a risk. Pepsi, Coca-Cola re-entered, the auto giants set up manufacturing, the tech companies invested in R&D centers, and then there was a birth of New India. Before 1991, running a business in India was slow and frustrating. If you wanted to start a company, you needed government license and approvals for almost everything. After 1991, things changed in a big way. Most licenses were removed, imports became easier, and the companies were finally allowed to grow based on the demand and not because of the permission. Industries exploded. The 1991 reforms coincided perfectly with the rise of the internet, with export restrictions gone and the foreign investments allowed. Infosys went public in 1993, Wipro transformed from consumer goods to IT, TCS scaled globally, and India became the world's back office. By 2000, India's software exports crossed $8 billion, and by 2024, recently, India's IT service exports exceeded $200 billion. The telecom industry, you ask, that saw a pivot, and how? In 1991, there were 5 million phone lines for 850 million people. The waiting period for a landline was 5 to 10 years, but now the private telecom was allowed, paving way for the mobile revolution. By 2024, India now has 1.2 billion mobile subscribers and the cheapest data globally. The aviation sector? Only government airlines were allowed till 1991, but post-reforms, the companies like Air Deccan, Jet Airways, Indigo, SpiceJet all emerged and flying became accessible to the middle class. Banking and finance, credit became accessible. Only nationalized banks were allowed in 1991, but post-reforms, we saw HDFC Bank, ICICI Bank, Axis Bank, all of them launching altogether. Competition improved service quality, and hence the credit access expanded. Over 300 million people were lifted out of poverty since 1991, the fastest poverty reduction in human history for any democracy to ever happen. Now to conclude, for 40 years we built an economy based on control and not growth. Protectionism, not competition. Ideology and not pragmatism. But today, let's be honest, India is still not anywhere close to where we should be. We are the 5th largest economy, yes, but we are still a country with a GDP per capita 5 times less than China's. We have 400 million in the middle class, but we still have more than 200 million in poverty. We have UPI and digital infrastructure, yes, but we still can't create enough manufacturing jobs. The reforms of 1991 opened the door, but India still hasn't fully walked through it. On the positive side, India is the second largest importer of gold globally, not because we are mortgaging it, but because our people can actually afford it. Today, Indian companies are investing abroad. They are buying foreign firms, setting up overseas operations. The nation that couldn't afford 2 weeks of imports in 1991 now has the fifth largest economy in the world. That's not just a recovery, that's transformation. The question now is, what comes next? Because the story of 1991 isn't over yet. It's just the first chapter of modern India's economic story. And the next chapter? How ready are we for AI, semiconductors, technology, innovation, and the most basic thing, which is clean air? We are writing the story now, and only time will tell. That's all from my side. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit like, share, and subscribe to Angel One Economics. We dig into economic stories that shape India, the crisis, the reforms, the triumphs, the unfinished business, everything. Drop a comment. What topic should we decode next? See you in the next one.